If I can have your attention. My name is Robert Borisaj. On behalf of the Campaign for America's Future and American Prospect magazine, I'm happy to greet you all in this next session of the Conference on the Failure of Conservatism. Here we will have a debate between two extraordinary protagonists, and the debate will be moderated, we're pleased to announce, by Karen Tumulty. Karen is the Time magazine national political correspondent who covers national political news for the magazine. Previously, she was the magazine's White House correspondent, and she's obviously known to many for her appearances on CNN, CNBC, CBS, and the Washington Week. Karen Tumulty.
I agreed to moderate this debate for one reason and one reason alone, and that's because it would guarantee me a really good seat. So let me just go over a little bit about what the format is going to be. Basically, we're going to start with an opening statement by Bob, followed by an opening statement by Bill, and then 4 minutes of rebuttal. A couple of questions from me, a couple of questions from the audience, and then they each get 5-minute closing statements. And if I can introduce you to our two debaters here today. Bill Kristol is the editor of the Weekly Standard, widely recognized as one of the nation's leading political analysts and commentators. And before founding the Weekly Standard, now 12 years ago, he led the Project for the Republican Future, which helped shape the strategy that produced the 1994 election victories for the Republicans. On the other side, we have Bob Kuttner, the co-founder and co-editor of The American Prospect, and also the author of a new book, The Squandering of America, published this fall, that addresses the connection between the political and economic inequality and the systemic risks facing the economy. He's also the author of 6 previous books and one of the founders of the Economic Policy Institute. So gentlemen, start your engines.
Well, thank you, and thanks to Bill for coming. We did this 5 years ago before a conservative group, so this is only fair. I think we're going to hear a lot, beginning tonight, of Gipper nostalgia. We're going to hear a lot of delicate bobbing and weaving in which the Republican presidential field tries to distance itself from George W. Bush without quite disowning Bush. We're going to hear that he wasn't quite what the conservative movement had in mind, that maybe he was a closet big spender or a foreign policy bungler, and that what America needs is a true conservative. But make no mistake, the Bush era was the conservative movement's moment. The right had wall-to-wall control of government. It had a cheering squad in the think tanks and the media. It had parliamentary discipline of the sort that is seldom seen in this republic. It took a village. It took a movement. It took the best the conservative movement had to offer. It took Cheney and Rumsfeld and Ken Lay and Tom DeLay and Bill Kristol and Grover Norquist and the K Street Project and the weird alliance between the religious right and Wall Street. And the right wing got 6 years in which to try out all of its ideas, everything from abstinence-only sex education to self-regulation by the drug industry and by Enron, to supply-side economics 2.0 on steroids, leaving us with a debt to central bankers from Asia, the total liberation of financial engineering, faith-based science, and a weird blend of Wilsonian idealism and Texas swagger. These were the fruits of conservative ideology, and it all crashed and burned. And at the center of it was the most feckless, feeble, ill-informed, and easily manipulable president, perhaps, ever. And the conservative movement took full advantage of the opportunity to fill the empty vessel of George W. Bush. The foreign policy was built on delusion. The economic strategy led to the widest gap between huge fortunes and the fortunes of ordinary people ever. The attempt to dismantle the core pillars of social insurance, Social Security, Medicare, by rebranding a society of vulnerability as an opportunity society was tried out and mercifully failed. And every day we see the results of not principled libertarianism, but simple opportunism, whether it is the student loan scandal or the failure to regulate the environment, the failure to enforce the laws that protect worker safety and health, and on and on and on. And when the serial failures of this conservative moment are added up, I think future historians are going to ask, where were the Republican patricians who cared about the Republic? Where were the conservative libertarians who cared about liberty? Where were the conservative foreign policy realists? Where were the fiscal conservatives? Where were the scientists who were principled conservatives who were not pandering to the religious right? And I think the failure of the Bush era is the failure both of conservative ideology and of financial elites who ought to know better. Now, what is strange, if you look forward to the election campaign, is that you are going to find Republican candidates delicately distancing themselves from Bush, but not from the Bush ideology, because the tendency to play to the base, even though the base is a smaller and smaller and smaller percentage of the American electorate, lingers on. And so you have three frontrunners who actually committed various heresies of moderation and who might be well positioned as something slightly different, doing whatever they can to follow the same playbook that Bush did. John Kennedy said famously that victory has 1,000 fathers and defeat is an orphan. And we are already seeing many conservatives run for the exits and to say that somehow Bush was not what they had in mind. But this was your moment. It had 1,000 fathers. George W. Bush could not have created this mess alone. And the irony is that Bush came into office with an opportunity to be a uniter, not a divider. And if he had chosen to govern as a moderate, as a healer, he might have built a center-right majority that could have lasted for a generation. But I think historians will record that this was the collapse of an era and the collapse of a movement and the collapse of an ideology. Thank you.
I feel that I'm here to adopt that poor orphan that Bob thinks is just everyone's running away from, and since I'm a compassionate conservative, I'm happy to take that orphan home. And if that orphan is modern conservatism, the conservative movement started over 50 years ago, the modern American conservative movement. It got modified in the 70s, I would say, particularly by the influence of religious conservatives on the one hand and neoconservatives on the other. Conservatism really came to power in 1980, obviously, with Reagan, and more or less, I think it's fair to say, shaped more public policies than not over the subsequent 25 years until now. And I am more than happy for conservative, I mean, given the normal complexities of any movement and its differences within itself and the difficulties of transforming theory into practice, et cetera, I'd be more than happy for conservatism to be judged by the results. Let's compare 1980 and today. Do we really think conservative economic policies have failed? I shouldn't ask rhetorical questions in this room since I guess I know the answer. Fine. If people who want to go back to the stagflation of 1979, 70% marginal tax rates, highly regulated airline industries, et cetera, can make that case. But I think on the whole, I'm very happy to defend the proposition that the basic thrust of supply-side economics, deregulation, tax cuts, freeing up of markets has been good for the country, has produced very impressive economic growth over a quarter century, has helped other parts of the world grow economically, that in other parts of the world, like China and India, I much prefer India as a democracy, but nonetheless in both of them, the adoption of market-based capitalist principles brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and that basically the conservative record on economics is a pretty impressive success by historical standards. I would even say a pretty unambiguous success, and the truth is the left isn't going to actually roll much of that back, and can't, I think, roll much of that back. So that was at the national level with Reagan. On economic policy, on other social issues, on crime, Rudy Giuliani took over the wonderful liberal city of New York and was an awfully effective mayor and reduced crime and made the city livable again. On welfare reform, we had a nice empirical test in 1996. That was a clear fight, a conservative priority for 20 years. Changing welfare, terrible predictions from the left about what a terrible disaster that would be. And I don't notice even the most left-wing Democratic presidential candidates campaigning on restoring AFDC. On cultural and social issues, that's more complicated, and obviously one doesn't have a kind of empirical test quite the way one does in some of these other areas, but I would very much defend the conservative and neoconservative concerns about the erosion of the family, the sense that a kind of excessive liberationism posed real risks to the social fabric, and especially to children. How one solves these problems is very complicated, and I would never claim that conservatives have all the answers there, but I think the alarm at some of these modern trends from the right, including from religious conservatives, was intelligent and somewhat vindicated by events. And in foreign policy, Reagan had one of the greatest vindications, I think, that any president can have, coming to power with a clear change of policy with respect to the Soviet Union, and leaving power as the Soviet Union crumbled, and then his successor, President Bush, presiding over the peaceful collapse of the Soviet Union, and then the integration of Central and Eastern Europe, at least, unfortunately, not Russia so much so far, but of Central and Eastern Europe into a Europe whole and free. Now here it gets complicated to say what's conservatism and what's not, but at least my form of conservatism, which I will Reaganite, neoconservative, aggressive willingness to use American power, both military, but also, of course, political and diplomatic, for supporting our friends and around the world and promoting democracy, I would say also has certainly been vindicated in the case of the Soviet Union and Europe, and actually Asia, I would say. Obviously, it's been tougher in the Middle East. I think it's the right prescription, however, in the Middle East. And the war in Iraq was badly executed, but I'm by no means willing to concede there, even there, that we would be better off not to have gone to war and to have Saddam reconstituting his nuclear weapons program, which George Tenet says in his book he would be doing by around 2007. So I think, actually, I'm perfectly happy to defend the achievements of conservatism on net over the last 25 years. And I hope liberals learn something from those achievements. And I'll come here 25 years from now and defend the achievements of a newly revitalized liberalism that's been informed by the great successes of the conservative movement.
And now we go to our 4-minute rebuttals.
Well, in 25 years, I will be happy to come back here and for both Compass Metis and debate you on the 25-year liberal era that is going to follow the meltdown of conservatism. You will notice in Bill's remarks that what was barely mentioned was Iraq, for good reasons, because it's the signal failure of neocon foreign policy. And what was barely mentioned was George W. Bush. Reagan ceased being president 18 years ago, and I think you could make a stretch of an argument that maybe the Reagan years weren't so bad, although they were certainly bad in terms of who benefited, but not a good sign that you have to reach back 18 years to defend conservatism. In fact, economic growth and who benefited from the growth was much, much more impressive in the 90s when, of course, Clinton was president. Welfare reform cut the welfare rolls. It sent people into the labor market. It could have been much kinder and gentler. It could have sent people back to school to learn skills that would pay decent jobs. It could have included decent child care. Today, I think the erosion of the family is much more due to economics than it is to cultural factors. People having to choose between their jobs and their children, families working 500 hours more per year than they did a generation ago just to keep even. That's the result of the way growth has been distributed. Last week we learned that the top hedge fund manager earned $1.7 billion in a year, and let me retract earned, made. And this is emblematic of the neocon or the con economy. It's a bit much to credit Reagan with the collapse of communism. Some people might credit Kennan. And in fact, it was the policy of containment which the antecedents of Rumsfeld and Cheney disparaged as the Dean Acheson College of Cowardly Containment that very accurately saw that communism would fall of its own weight if we didn't start World War III. And this is really the first time that people around the world have real reasons to worry about whose finger is on the nuclear trigger and whether the most powerful leader in the world is reality-based or delusional. And we still have 18 more months before we can breathe a bit easier. So Bill can make a very adroit argument that conservatism has been a success, but the voters are going to decide that. And fewer and fewer and fewer voters are buying either the ideology or the incumbent. Gallup had a remarkable study out about 2 weeks ago which showed that the percentage of Americans who believe that the rich have too much money and that the government ought to play a more active role in creating opportunity for regular people, those numbers are at their highest since 1939. And my question really is more for liberals and for Democrats. I think there's no doubt that conservatism has been thoroughly discredited by the verdict of history, but I fear that the residual power of wealth in this country, the translation of wealth into political power, is so strong that even if a Democrat gets elected, even if the Democrats pick up seats in both houses, it's going to be hard to reverse that momentum. It's going to be hard to rebuild the pillars on which the opportunity and security of the mixed economy of the post-war era were built. Some of the disasters of the past several years had some conservative Democrats supporting them. The repeal of Glass-Steagall was a bipartisan hit job. You have Democrats as well as Republicans, often more Democrats than Republicans, preaching budget balance as the mother of all virtues rather than social investment. And so I think the challenge for progressives is to not be complacent and to not assume that the collapse of conservatism is the revival of progressivism. That will take real work.
I was glad to hear Bob defend Rubenomics in the 90s, and I will be happy to, if that's the alternative to Reaganomics, that's fine with me. We can have a decade of Reaganomics and then a decade of Rubenomics, and that will be the two-party system in America, and that's what we've had in 25 years. Well, that's what we have had, and you wanted to cite Clinton's economic performance in the 90s as a counter to Reagan's success, and I'm saying fine. I accept Clinton's economic performance as basically conservative, and he certainly, and I don't believe that any Democratic candidate is going to want to go back to the, as I say, 70% tax rates. George Kennan was an impressive man, and the doctrine of containment is one that I support, but the real existing alternative to Ronald Reagan was Jimmy Carter, and I would say that Reagan's foreign policy was more successful than Carter's. But let me not run away from Bush and Iraq, because I want to defend Bush too. I mean, the truth is, on net, we had an experiment on these tax cuts. Supply-side tax cuts were passed in 2003. Let's go back and look at the predictions and see who came closer in terms of how big the budget deficit is today. It's lower than when the tax cuts were passed. How high unemployment is today, lower than when the tax cuts were passed. Even actually income inequality, which always takes the working class wage boosts, which take longer to come back in when you recover from a recession, as we were recovering after the collapse of the dot-com bubble, has now begun to come up a little bit. So not everything's great, and I myself would urge Republicans to move in a direction that Matt Continetti's written about and others at the Weekly Standard of Sam's Club republicanism. I mean, thinking more creatively about how to reform government programs for the working class and for the stretched sort of working class, middle class, how to be pro-family in a way that's consistent with respecting market principles and the like. That's a perfectly reasonable second generation, third generation conservative agenda item, and there are some interesting liberal contributions to be made to that thinking. But that's not fundamentally, I think, going to reverse the achievements of conservative domestic policy. And we had a very nice test case in New York, the most liberal city that was governed most sort of strenuously and consistently by liberal principles for decades, and it took Giuliani to come in and fundamentally reverse those principles in 2 or 3 key areas. And I think New York is an awful lot more livable city now, especially, including for rich people, but also for poor people and also for recent immigrants, legal and illegal, than it was under David Dinkins. So I'm happy to stand with Reagan against Carter, with Giuliani against Dinkins. I've drifted away from Bush again. I suppose this proves Bob's point. My subconscious keeps dragging me slightly bit away from him. But look, the truth is, I'm happy to debate Iraq. That's a whole different story. But I will defend the economic policy. I'll defend the foreign policy. And the next Democratic president is going to end up with a foreign policy much more like Bush's, maybe not in style, but in content, than people think, because the world is the way the world is. And there's a jihadist Islam, and there are terror networks, and Iran is getting, well, there is a jihadist Islam. We could discuss how big and how threatening it is. I think it's pretty threatening, and it's threatening when it's related to terror groups, and it's threatening when there are regimes that are seeking nuclear weapons that embrace forms of that. And the next president's going to have to deal with it, whether he's Democratic or Republican. I do wish we had more. It would be healthier for the country to have a more bipartisan foreign policy, and occasionally I think that having a Democrat as president who would sort of do what Eisenhower did after Truman in a sense and make what would be the basic structure of Bush's foreign policy a bipartisan effort, which is I think what would happen, might be a healthy thing for the country. But I can't quite follow the logic of that thought too far and actually fully embrace the Hillary Clinton candidacy. And I won't do that because that would not help her, I think, in the Democratic primary.
Well, Bob, my question to you is if, in fact, some of Bill Clinton's hardest fought achievements, you talked about welfare reform, the crime bill, were fundamentally based on conservative ideas. We're building on conservative ideas, free trade being another one. But with the exception of free trade, you really don't hear the Democratic candidates talking a lot about turning back those ideas. And if these ideas were such a failure, then why are Democrats not talking about turning them back?
Well, I think let's differentiate between Rubenomics, which I could spend a whole hour debating, and some of the other initiatives. I do think you're going to hear Democratic candidates talking about doing more for economic security and for economic opportunity. Clinton was a centrist president. He was a centrist president who had to contend with a Republican House. And in a lot of cases, he split the difference, and in some cases, he went beyond splitting the difference. Welfare reform could have been done and should be done much more humanely. We need things that go far beyond the Clinton social program that I do think you'll hear Democratic candidates standing for, such as universal health insurance, such as universal pre-kindergarten. And I'm not here as the Democrat. I'm here as the progressive. And I think Democratic conservatives have done a lot of damage by validating a kind of a milder version of hard right ideology. If you can, Rubin falsely claims credit for the boom of the 90s. It had a lot more to do with productivity growth finally bearing fruit and the Federal Reserve deciding to take its foot off the brake, none of which had anything to do with deficit reduction. And I think the biggest single mistake the Democrats make is to think that this cycle, which Bill so warmly alludes to, of Democrats cutting taxes and then Republicans cutting taxes and then Democrats reciprocating by cutting spending, if this goes on and on and on, you'll end up with a government, as our friend Grover Norquist likes to say, that's so small that it can be drowned in the bathtub. And that's not exactly progressive. There are all kinds of social needs that should be addressed, and I hope Democrats will move in that direction.
I actually have no particular stake in Rubenomics one way or the other. I'm not a particular fan of Bob Rubin, but I just knew at an event with Bob Kuttner and sponsored by the Campaign for America's Future, I had to say the word Rubenomics early on to get everyone's hackles up, you know. Reagan's fine with you guys, but Rubin, that's really the devil. I have to think of other, you know, people I could cite of that nature.
Lieberman.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll save that for you. I don't have any.
Well, I was going to ask a question, but it also, as it turns out, came from the audience, Bill. Why do Republicans preach smaller government but increase government spending and the national debt far more than Democrats when they get in power? What's the disconnect between the idea and the execution here?
Well, one disconnect is, I mean, not all Republicans are libertarian or Grover Norquist like small government Republicans. I think those of us who are neoconservatives were more willing to accept, not more willing, we're willing to accept the conservative welfare state and try to reform it in ways that might leave government spending at around 20% of GDP, which in fact is what's happened. It does seem that there's a pretty strong political consensus, or at least in this country, where it's hard to budge overall federal government expenditures too much above or below 1/5 of GDP. And so liberals promise, you know, grand things, and conservatives promise grand cuts, and neither tends to happen. The system is very resistant to radical change. I don't think that's a bad thing. I'm not for particularly, I don't go to sleep at night worrying that we're spending that the federal government's taking about 20% of GDP. It seems to be perfectly, actually quite reasonable. It's better than taking 40 or 50% of GDP, I think, and I think that's one reason we're doing better than some of those countries that do take 40 or 50% of GDP. I do think there's an important, for conservatives, the kind of conservative reform agenda is important. And let me mention a Bush program, which I was ambivalent about and don't actually know a huge amount about, but the Medicare plan, which, you know, was very controversial among conservatives, certainly opposed by the Democrats and by the left in 2003. And I would say that Medicare Part D, the prescription drug benefit, actually seems to be working pretty well. You know, it's costing less money than people. I mean, I think there are ways to do it where we wouldn't be giving this benefit to upper income seniors, but it was decided to do it universally. And the fact is it's coming in under budget, and a huge number of seniors are getting cheaper drugs and getting them pretty effectively. So that's fine. So that was passed by Bush and a Republican Congress.
But that was not a conservative idea.
Well, we can't have it both ways, you know. You know, we're blamed for everything Bush and a Republican Congress does, and it was the two major pieces of legislation they passed were Medicare Part D and the tax cuts, and I think both have worked out as legislation goes with all of the unintended consequences. Those are two pretty good achievements, judging from the results.
I mean, I come back for a moment on Medicare Part D.
Sure.
I mean, people who've really looked at this issue, I think, are quite aware that Medicare Part D was designed as a subsidy to the drug industry and a subsidy to the insurance industry, and as the entering wedge at an assault on public Medicare. And one of the reasons why it's come in below budget is that the donut hole is so large that a lot of seniors find that it's not cost effective to take the policy. So it's a classic example of what happens when you put people who don't have any respect for government in charge of government and see it as an opportunity to enrich industry allies and to destroy social programs by stealth.
I have to say that was my question, and my whole point, half of my point was about military. It's half of all U.S. discretionary spending. Half of all military spending in the world is by the U.S., and it's over $100 billion every year for this Iraq war. The big elephant in the room is the Iraq war and the ridiculous waste of money on that and the Reagan military buildup, and you didn't even mention it. It was left out of my question.
I'm happy to, if you'd like, I can mention it. I'm happy to defend the Reagan military buildup as an incredibly cost-effective way to hasten the decline, the peaceful demise of the Soviet Union. We then took military spending, leveled it off in the 90s, and cut the size of the military too much. We should have increased military spending more, in my view, in the late 90s, and certainly after 9/11. One of the biggest mistakes of Iraq has been trying to conduct a post-9/11 foreign policy with a pre-9/11 size military and doing it through supplemental appropriations, which isn't the most effective way to obviously build up the military. We spend 4%, 4.5%, even including the subs, of GDP on the military. That is not a high number by post-World War II standards. It's not a high number. It's no higher than it was even in 1989, you know, when the Cold War ended. And we can certainly afford it, and we should probably spend more, not less, I think, on the military.
Well,
Bob?
if I can come back on that, one of the things that George Bush managed to slither out of was responsibility for 9/11. Let's call a spade a spade. I mean, if he had been any kind of a president who had been dealing with reality, the Bush administration would have paid attention to all of the warnings in the first 9 months of 2001, and the plot would have been foiled. And instead, it became a Thank you. And instead, it became a pretext for a state of permanent emergency to give the president permanent emergency powers and frustrate constitutional government in this country. Now, you asked, Karen, what was conservative about an increase in spending. Most of the increase in spending has been for the war, which was, I think most people in this room would agree, and most of the American public increasingly agree, was a needless war. There are certainly needs to spend money on protecting Americans from jihadism, but the conflation of Iraq with terrorism, other kinds of terrorism, was a complete phony that's been completely discredited. And one of the things that Bill said to me at lunch, I don't think I'm betraying a confidence by repeating this, is that Democrats are going to have trouble saying what they're for in Iraq. So the right's, in effect, saying that we have made such a complete mess of this that even the opposition can't figure out a graceful way out. I would say that's small comfort. It certainly doesn't reflect well on the Project for a New American Century or on neoconservative foreign policy.
Well,
I can just say a word.
Sure.
I mean, I say something casually at lunch as an analytical matter in a conversation with others, that it's going to be tricky politically. It's not so one-sided as people now think, just how Iraq plays out in '08, and that the Democrats will have to explain what it means to, quote, get out of Iraq or end the war. And there are differences, obviously, among Democrats on that. And this is taken to be some kind of cynical political statement. It wasn't a cynical political statement. It's a true fact. It's a true fact.
It's a testament. I wish I could remember the Casey Stengel quote about how you screwed this thing up so totally that nobody knows what to do.
I'm not for getting out. I've defended the surge. I've defended Bush, and I've defended staying there. So I'm not trying to be cute about this. I'm not for the different Democratic alternatives. Having said that, if a Democrat wins the presidency committed to getting out of Iraq, that Democratic president is going to have to figure out what to do, and they are running for president in the world we're living in. Several of them voted to authorize this war, and certainly voted to appropriate funds for it. And it's just a matter of responsibility for them to explain what their policy is going for. But they don't have to defend it. You don't have to defend the war in Iraq. I'm happy to defend it. I'm not running away from it. I'm not trying to deflect responsibility. I will defend it.
well, since the topic of this debate is can conservatives be trusted to govern, which also suggests a question of competence, we have this question from the audience. 5.5 years after 9/11, why can't the Bush administration and conservatives guarantee the safety of my cat's food supply?
Yeah. My cat too, so that's yeah. Look, it's not been the most competent administration in history. Karen mentioned the title, which I think we hadn't mentioned before, conservatives be trusted to govern. I want to make clear, my answer to that is no. You shouldn't trust anyone to govern. This is a deep principle of the American regime and a deep principle of conservatism, and you should trust but verify. And honestly, if people do believe that not simply that Bush made mistakes and made some bad appointments, but that conservatism, qua conservatism, is discredited, obviously they should vote against conservatives, and many Americans did in the last election, and they may do it in November 2008. But there is no contradiction, I believe, between conservative principles and competent administration. I don't know anything about really the pet food issue and whether that was some incompetent political hack at somewhere at FDA or was just a normal government screw up or something that maybe happens anyway, that every administration has some mistake like that, I suppose. But anyway, people will have to make that judgment as to how. But it's not the case, I think, that I'm very unconvinced by these arguments that conservatives are skeptical about government. Therefore, conservatives can't administer government. Katrina is the example of this. I was a big critic of Bush's, obviously, management of Katrina, both before and after. We also had a conservative Republican governor and a Democratic governor who had to handle Katrina. And maybe people, I'm not going to say that because Haley Barbour did an infinitely better job than Governor Blanco, that proves that conservatives are great at disaster management and liberals are bad. It just happens that Haley Barbour is a more competent executive than Governor Blanco.
Well, let me challenge that. Let me invert a famous unfortunate line of Michael Dukakis. This is not about competence, it's about ideology. And some of the systemic failures of conservatism are direct outgrowths of conservative ideology. If there are principled attacks on regulation, I think they're mostly wrong. They lead to things like Enron. And then there are simply corrupt attacks on law enforcement where you put, pick one, there are hundreds, you pick, you put executives of the student loan industry in charge of policing the student loan industry. You put executives of the drug companies in charge of assuring the safety of our drugs and our food. And if you start out with that ideology, it logically follows that you're going to get opportunistic acts. You may not always get people as bad as Brownie. That may be a uniquely Bush kind of ineptitude. But you do get the systemic corruption, and I do think that goes hand in hand with the hate government ideology.
Well, Bob, we have a question here saying from the audience, isn't the creation of parallel academic and media institution by conservatives to promulgate their ideology proof they never had the courage of their convictions? If they had better ideas, wouldn't they have triumphed in and of themselves? And my addition to that question would be, then, if that were the case, why is it that the other side now is attempting to create those exact kinds of institutions themselves?
Well, I think one of the wisest investments the economic elite in this country ever made was in people like Bill Kristol and in institutions like AEI and Heritage. I've believed all of my life that ideas matter. I wish I could persuade some more wealthy liberals that investment in progressive institutions such as mine was a smart thing to do. The irony is that liberals have been arguing for years and years and years that ideas matter, and I think this was proven to a fairly well by conservatives. So I don't think this was a mark of a failure of conservatives to win in the marketplace of ideas. I think this was a very shrewd investment by conservative elites. Whether it's elevated the quality of debate is another question, because you have this odd marriage between principled conservative intellectuals like Bill and some absolute hacks like the K Street Project, and they both seem to have this weird symbiosis with each other. But at least investments are being made in ideas.
How about you, Bill? How important do you think these sorts of institutions were to getting conservative ideas out?
Well, I think they were useful because other places weren't friendly to conservative ideas. I mean, if conservatives aren't going to get tenure in political science departments, more conservatives are going to end up at think tanks, and more liberals are going to dominate the academy. And it still seems to me, net in terms of body weight, resources, and prestige, liberals are doing pretty well in dominating more of the major intellectual, academic, and cultural institutions in this country than conservatives. So I'm happy if conservatives have been effective with their lesser resources, but the endowments of conservative think tanks, it's pretty lopsided. But I'm not complaining. I mean, people should go where they can go and make the arguments they can make, and I think conservatives have tried hard to do that. Charles Krauthammer had a quip once about Fox News Channel, just to mention something popular in this room, that someone said to him, well, that was brilliant of Murdoch to see that there was a niche for a conservative, more conservative, fair and balanced, I should say, network. And Charles said, yeah, it was very brilliant of Murdoch. He saw the niche was 51% of the American people, and there is some truth to that.
Not much.
Well, Bill, you had earlier mentioned some of the kinds of ideas, in fact, that you've been writing about in your magazine, Sam's Club Republicanism. One question from the audience is, how long will conservatives wander in the wilderness this time, i.e. post-Iraq and Bush?
I don't know. Politics is so unpredictable. Republicans might lose probably you'd have to bet right now that the odds are slightly better than 50-50. I think the Republicans lose in 08, but I don't think overwhelmingly better than 50-50. And of course, the low point of republicanism, the worst Republican election before 2006, the most recent worst Republican election was 1974, and 6 years later, Reagan was president. So these things can reverse very quickly. All the Republicans, some of them were chortling about the permanent governing Republican majority in 2000 or 2004, and that reversed awfully quickly. So I'm not a big believer in the inevitability of these trends, and it's a very volatile world out there. And and politicians and democracies, whatever their flaws, one of their virtues is they react pretty quickly to changes in public sentiment. So I think 06 was a shock that's still sinking in for Republicans, and I hope it will lead to real rethinking and sort of fresh thinking, I guess I should say, moving forward on some of these, especially on some of these domestic policy issues. And also on the foreign policy side, though, I'm a defender of the General Bush doctrine. I think the institutionalization of it, the failure to think hard about how to make it work in practice, was a failure of the Bush administration, and I think the next Republican candidate, if he's going to win, is going to have to persuasively explain how he could have similar goals to Bush but execute them more competently.
So how about you, Bob? Do you think it's a movement that's been repudiated, or do you think it has a next act?
Well, I think it's a movement that is about to be repudiated big time for now. Certainly the public opinion polls show that the public has lost confidence not just in the Iraq War, but in Bush as a president and in conservative ideas. I mean, there's more support for government playing a proactive role in the economy than there has been in many decades. I want to quote a well-known pundit who recently wrote, there's almost no precedent for a party retaining the presidency in a shambles, and Bill wrote that in the Weekly Standard a few weeks ago. But interestingly, he wrote it in the context of urging Bush not to seek accommodation with the Democrats, but to be tough. And I think this president's tragedy, if it even rises to tragedy, is that he might have been a uniter, not a divider. And just about everything that he promised on the campaign trail and in his inaugural speech turned out to be a lie, that he governed as a hard-right conservative, even though he didn't have a mandate for that. And I think government is going to tarnish conservatism generally.
Well, we have another question from the audience about public funding of elections. And certainly, I mean, after McCain-Feingold, we see this ideological war is being fought outside the two-party system in many, many ways. More money is going into elections than ever before. So the question is, how could public funding of elections transform American politics?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, McCain-Feingold tried to fix a broken system, and we now have a slightly differently broken system. The one good thing about McCain-Feingold, I think, was the doubling of the limits, which encouraged more. I mean, there's a lot of participation in politics right now, and a lot of participation in giving money to politicians, which is healthy. I mean, the Obama phenomenon is pretty startling, and in that respect, maybe the current system can be slightly tweaked to more matching funds for low-dollar contributions, things like that. I'm certainly open to it. It turns out to be very hard in a free country to stop money from influencing politics, and people will buy newspapers or TV stations or magazines, and there is a free speech issue, and on the internet that's even magnified, in really trying, I think, to stop people from advocating policies. And since policies are, as Bob has shown here, closely associated with individuals, it's very hard, in the case of, let's say, Iraq and Bush, I mean, it's very hard to stop people from mentioning names 60 days before an election. So I would be mostly for a transparency but deregulatory approach on campaign finance. The regulatory challenges of public financing, I think, are very great. And you still have a free country in which people can spend money outside of the system. And I think the current system where rich people, however, can self-finance and everyone else has to go out and raise money is a little crazy. I mean, that really is a bizarre product of, I guess, a mix of legislation and a Supreme Court decision, ending up in a situation where if you're extremely wealthy, you can self-finance, but if you're a candidate of modest means who has wealthy backers, you can't take their money, fully disclose it, and run. And that I think, is crazy.
Well, I am all in favor of public financing of elections. I think in places like Maine, where you have this clean election option, it's brought whole new kinds of people into politics. It's relieved politicians from having to spend inordinate amount of time cultivating rich people. The problem is that the Supreme Court is very unlikely anytime soon to allow public financing of elections in a serious way at the federal level. And of course, the problem is that it tilts the entire system to the right because Democrats as well as Republicans spend huge amounts of time with unrepresentative people. One of the antidotes is for little people to get more involved in politics, as we've seen through Move On, as we've seen to some extent through Obama. If you have a campaigner who's really exciting, you hope that small money and organizing energy can offset the influence of big money.
Well, that actually sort of leads into another question from the audience. In light of corporate influence in the Democratic Party, will its leadership be willing to address the damage done to America by conservatives?
Well, that's, and I want to save some of this for my closing remarks, that's the $64 zillion question. The tilt in this country is towards big money. And as the income distribution becomes more concentrated, so does the distribution of political power. Now, for the Republicans, that's not a contradiction. Wealthy Republicans pay Republicans to be Republicans and to carry out conservative ideology. Wealthy Democrats, for the most part, except on social issues, pay Democrats to be less like Democrats. So one party starts out with one hand tied behind its back. And I think the cure for that is leadership. I think there's a latent desire in this country for more economic security, for more economic opportunity, for policies that don't leave people at the mercy of their HMO, at the mercy of their employer if they happen to get sick and a child needs their attention and they've been told to report to work. And I think if we had courageous politicians on the liberal side, there could be a real landslide in favor of liberal policies. I think the jury is very much out on that question.
Bill?
What part of it do you want me to answer?
Well, I think if this is the case, I think we're ready to go to closing statements, and it's your turn.
Yeah, I don't have any. Don't think I need to defend the corporate dominance of everything in America.
Oh, go ahead.
Why not?
Be my guest.
I hope Rupert succeeds in buying the Wall Street Journal and turning that into a right-wing organ. Oh, yeah, it already is. Look, I hope there's a vigorous liberalism. This country needs a vigorous liberalism, obviously, if only to check a usually dominant and governing conservatism. That would be a nice state of affairs. And I am encouraged by signs of liberal revival in that respect and some fresh thinking among liberals. I would urge, it's not my business to tell liberals what to do, but liberals really shouldn't define themselves simply as anti-conservatives. You know, this was the great charge against conservatives way back in the 50s. They're just a bunch of people who have grievances against liberalism. I would say that sometimes these days liberals look like a bunch of people who have terrible grievances against conservatism. And in fact, the great liberal tradition deserves better than that. So I hope we have a vigorous liberalism. We do need a rejuvenated conservatism, partly because of our successes. I mean, this is the problem with getting the economy going pretty well and getting the world economy going pretty well, with defeating the Soviet Union and having the Cold War end. That made possible, obviously, I think, Clinton's victory in '92. We had a domestic policy election for the first time in a while. And other, crime, welfare, that's all taken for granted. So now we can focus on other issues. So we need a conservatism that moves beyond some of the issues with which conservatives, I think correctly, were preoccupied in the past. A rejuvenated conservatism. I hope liberalism can move beyond being a reactionary liberalism. And I would say that, in conclusion, neoconservatism consisted of liberals who were mugged by reality. Some of them were already middle-aged when that happens, and it's never too late to become a neoconservative.
Well, this has felt a little bit like that '80s show. If the biggest challenge to conservatism is to move beyond its recent successes, then what we need is not just a reality-based foreign policy, but we need some reality-based political strategies. I don't think there's a danger that liberals will simply be reactive. certainly not this kind of liberal, and I think there's a whole unfinished agenda, and for the first time in a long time, we have a tailwind on our side because of the multiple failures of conservatism. In the last several decades, foreign policy has been the conservative trump. Even if you prefer progressives on economics, a lot of Americans think that conservatives are more likely to keep this country safe. And I think in the same way that the Great Depression happening on Herbert Hoover's watch discredited Republicans as stewards of the economy, the Iraq mess is going to discredit Republicans as stewards of national security for a very long time. But let's not forget that the takeover by Democrats of both houses of Congress in '06 was more about pocketbook issues than it was about even foreign policy. If people like Sherrod Brown, who is going to be speaking a little later today, had not run on pocketbook issues and articulated the frustrations of ordinary people in Ohio, which is supposed to be a conservative state, and had only run on criticism of Iraq, he wouldn't have won. And I think that's the lesson for the presidential field in '08 on the Democratic side. I don't think it's a slam dunk, to quote Tenet, by any means, but I think it's the greatest opportunity, not just the Democrats have had, but the progressives have had, to build an affirmative program in many decades. And I suppose we can thank the fact that conservatism got a full field trial and fell flat in its face for that opportunity. So thank you, Bill, for coming.
And thank both of you for being willing to engage.